Okay, well, good morning, and thank you for the invitation in the first place. As was mentioned already, I'm an alumni of the Geography Department. I congratulated on his 40th birthday. Funny enough, for half of that time, I have been sort of connected in some way or another, either as a student or as an alumni to the department. And I've gone over to the dark side of economics, having studied economics and geography at Maynooth. Most of what I do in economics still has very much a spatial dimension. And one of the things that I deal with is trade, which is inherently spatial because it goes from one place to another. Now, when Chris asked me to give a talk, he had me lined up with Fortieth, and Fortieth had already decided on what he was going to talk about, and what I wanted to really talk about traffic, which is something that I really deal with a lot these days. Fortieth was already going to talk about trade. Now, as it happened, I already had done some work a couple of years ago for Intertrade Ireland, and I want to acknowledge their financial support for this work on North-South trade, and that is North-South trade within Ireland. A lot of people think North-South trade, oh, that's trade between Europe and Africa. No, it's between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. And at the time, I'd given Chris a very loose title, North-South trade, and went into the program, and at that point, there wasn't any point in changing it. And what am I going to look at today is whether the level of trade between the two parts of Ireland is what you would expect, or is it more, or is it less? And in doing so, I'm going to cover quite a few of the things that Fortieth has already talked about. And what I'm going to focus on is merchandise trade, and the reason for that is not that I wasn't aware of the services trade importance, but the fact that we have no data for services trade, or no reliable data for services trade between the two parts of Ireland. And in fact, we are unusual in having reasonable data for merchandise trade at the regional level, although there are some issues, and if you can look up my publications, and there are a number on looking at the quality of some of this data, and unfortunately trade data isn't as good as some people make it out to be. Now, just as a quick introduction again, given the island location, the relatively small scale of Ireland, it would seem to make a lot of sense to have a high level of trade integration between the two parts of Ireland, giving us some kind of a scale, economies and so on, and there should be benefits from a higher trade intensity, the usual trade benefits that would be well established in the literature. Now, when you look at the trade flows between North and South, and also between the UK and Ireland, and Fortieth looked at it a little bit, you find actually that the share of Irish exports to the UK are declining all the time. But that isn't actually the case with respect to Northern Ireland. The share is relatively stable, so you would think, well, there isn't a story here. But of course, just looking at shares like that doesn't really tell you whether this is the right level of trade or not. And what I'm looking at is exactly that. And in doing so, I'm looking at basically updating some analysis that was done in UCD and published in the Economic and Social Review in 1999 by Emma Fitzsimons, Vincent Hogan, and Peter Neary. And what I found is that there are really two omitted variables in their analysis, which gives rise to an omitted variables problem. And I'm getting somewhat different results to them. But I also want to consider sectors, because they only look at aggregate trade, and clearly, as Fortieth has shown, sectors are actually quite heterogeneous. And the other thing is, I want to find out why we trade more or less with Northern Ireland. So I don't just want to see, is that the level that we should have, but I want to see what drives that. Now, I must apologize, there are some technical details in here which I'll brush over, but if you want to discuss the finer points between a Houseman-Taylor estimator and a random effects estimator, we can do that, but I suspect we probably don't want to get into that too much. But there is a degree of technical detail in the actual work. Now, trade flows are typical spatial interaction. And one way to model spatial interactions is to use a gravity model. And funny enough, that's something that unifies a lot of the social sciences. They use a spatial interaction model. So it's quite widely used in geography, but it's also extremely widely used in economics and particularly in trade. The basic specification is this equation there where X is the export and it depends on income. That's the gravitational variable. So if you're a rich country, you will import more, you will suck in trade. If you are a country that is rich, you will also have quite a lot to export. So that's why we have the incomes of both importing and exporting country there. And of course there's a friction, the distance, which approximates all kinds of transactions costs. Now I actually did my PhD on this model, and of course distance is a very crude approximation of transactions cost, and that was really what my PhD was about. But let's just leave the model as it is. In practice, you add a lot of different variables to this. And I will just move on and I'll show you some results in a minute. Now I have data from 1988 to 2007 for aggregate trade and 1992 to 2007 for sectors. 2007, at the time I did this work, that was the furthest I could go. And as Pontius said, the recent upheavals in the economy here would suggest that perhaps using data more recent than that would introduce quite a bit of noise in the analysis as well. I'm using exports, merchandise only, 43 countries, and I think I'm using the same source as yourself, Comtrade. Plus, I'm using some CSO data, and that's the trade for exports and imports to and from Northern Ireland, and then LTV separately. That wouldn't be available from Comtrade. They only care about full countries. I have 14 sectors, although one of them, fuels, is a bit iffy, and it's not particularly useful to look at because it's a very strange sector. Now, to get to sectors from the product level data, you have to do some matching. And I'm sure, Pontius, you've come across this. This is a horrendous task because you've got potentially thousands and thousands of different types of products. And odious, whatever it was, substances is just one of those many, and you have to figure out which sector produces that stuff. So you have to match into sectors to do a sort of more formal analysis because you want to have some data on GDPs by sector and so on. In practice, it's very hard to match. 80% is what I managed, and that's after quite a bit of trying. And then I focus particularly in my analysis on the north-south trade. Now, 43 countries, so I have a large panel, 43 countries, so I have 43 by 42 trade flows for the years I have there. So it's a very large panel. What I'm really interested in is, given the kind of patterns I see between all of these countries, how does the trade between Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland vary from what is expected? And to do that, I introduce some dummy variables in into my analysis. And the other thing that I introduced, which wasn't in the original Fitzsimons et al. Paper, was to account for the fact that Ireland is an island. That would seem to be sort of important because getting exports off an island is more difficult. And of course, we also have an island with one shared land border, i.e. Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland share a border. Again, that would seem to be important. If you have an island that doesn't have a land border, well, the only way to export is off. If you have an island that actually has two jurisdictions, then you would think that it's much easier to export or import between those two parts. And that's, I think, a crucial omitted variable in the original analysis. Now, skip over estimation. Now, what do I find? And I spared you the detail of the parameters, but if you'd like to have a look at them, they're actually all very much within keeping of what you find in the international literature. And at the moment, I'm involved in doing a large meta-analysis, and I'm looking at over 500 papers that have used the gravity model, so I have a reasonably good handle on what the parameters should look like. GDP, yes, more GDP, more trade. Population, same story. A larger country in terms of population tends to trade more. Distance, distance reduces trade. So the further you are away, the trading partners are away from each other, the less they trade. Common border, if you're an immediate neighbor, you tend to trade more. That would have a number of reasons. One of them would be the common language, which I account for separately. Again, if you have a common language, you trade more. Very easy. If you can talk to people, you're more likely to be able to trade. If you can't talk to them, there's a friction there that would reduce the interaction. Trade agreement, like being in the EU or NAFTA, is positive. Again, theory would tell us that that's what it is, and internationally that's what's found. Then I have two dummy variables, north to south, that is exports from Northern Ireland to the Republic of Ireland. And if you look at just the random effects column, what do I find? Negative and significant. So what that would suggest is that when I'm taking account of all these other factors, the level of exports from Northern Ireland to the Republic is less than we would expect. South to north, that's also negative, but it's only statistically significant at a 10% level, so you would have some doubts as to whether that is really a strong result. Exporters with only one neighbour, and in this sense it's a land border, and that would be the case for us here. We have one neighbour, Northern Ireland. That would increase your export. Importers with only one neighbour, that would increase your imports as well. The euro is kind of interesting. If both countries, country pairs, countries that in the pair that are trading have the euro, it's negative but not significant. If you're an exporter and you have the euro, it is positive and significant. If you're an importer and you have the euro, it's negative and significant. And it's kind of interesting when you look at the sectoral level, there are quite a few sectors where the euro has a negative and significant effect. So sometimes when we're talking about how important the euro is, when it comes to trade, the jury, I think, is out. And there are a number of other papers that are looking at that, where they're finding particular sectors where the euro is actually a negative factor. I have a number of other things there. Exporter an island, importer an island, landlocked. Landlocked tends to be a bad thing for trade. If you're a landlocked country, you tend to trade less. That's probably partly that is historic in the sense that a lot of trade in the past, when infrastructure was poor, had to go by ship. If you didn't have a sea connection, it's going to be very difficult for you to get it out by horse and cart. And one thing we know about trade flows is they're highly persistent. Anyway, that's what it looks like at the aggregate level, total merchandise trade. Now, at the sectoral level, these are the parameter estimates for the north-south zone. And you see that they're almost always negative, except for one sector, non-metallic minerals. Now, what do non-metallic minerals produce? Glass, bricks, things like that. Things that are actually quite heavy relative to their value. You wouldn't actually trade them very far. You also find that food and textile, the parameter estimates are very small. And that's, again, something where we have some similarities across the two jurisdictions, or the two parts of Ireland. But then you can also see electrical and optical equipment. We have a huge negative effect on or rather, and we have a hugely less trade than we would expect. And likewise, chemicals is quite high. And when we do it the other way around, from the south to the north, we find sort of a similar example. Electrical and optical equipment is very, very different. Non-metallic minerals, we might actually be trading a little bit more than we'd expect. Food, we're more or less where we should be. And then there are a number of sectors which have a sort of a somewhere between -1 and -2 parameter value. Now, what does that mean? Firstly, basically our explanatory variables are all correctly signed and significant and so on. So what's estimated seems to be robust. The dummy variables for the north-south and south-north trade are generally negative. In some cases they're significant statistically, and in some cases they're not. Of course, you have to remember that there are only 16 annual observations here, so we're asking quite a lot of the data. And when we do get statistically significant, I think that's quite a strong result. So the trade is below what we would expect. In some cases, electrical and optical equipment, we would actually expect double the trade. And initially, when we did this analysis, I was getting very worried about the size of this gap. But there are some other papers, and there's one mentioned here, which find similar gaps in other trade flows. So it's not totally unusual. South-north trade seems to deviate less than north-south trade. Now, that's just sort of a finding. Well, there we are. There's a gap. But what explains the gap? And that's much more interesting to me, and when it comes to policymakers, it's a much more important point. So can we say something more? And this is where I get back to some of the things that Francis already talked about. Firstly, a lot of our trade flows, and internationally it's something in the region of 70%, are actually intermediate goods. And that would imply that if the underlying sectoral structure is very, very important in driving your trade patterns. So if you've got a particular sector in your country, it's likely to trade more with similar sector. And so you would expect, if you've got a high preponderance of chemicals and pharmaceuticals, that there would be quite a lot of intermediate inputs imported from the same sector. To the extent that the two parts of Ireland are different in industrial structure, that might drive the result. So if there are no chemical plants in Northern Ireland, then you couldn't really expect there to be any imports of chemicals into the Republic of Ireland. But if that's what we're actually importing, well, then there's a reason why we might not find a huge amount of trade. The other thing is the multinationals, and I think Francis actually gave a very good account of the kinds of things involved there. The fact that there's a lot of intra-firm trade, that there's a lot of very specific trade to specific markets, so we tend to serve Europe and the Middle East, or other specific markets, and I've recently been talking to various firms or groups of firms, and it's quite interesting how they organize themselves. So I talked to a German firm recently, and they seem to have grouped all their subsidiaries in Northern Europe, but in a very peculiar way. They seem to include some countries and not others. So they seem to trade within that group, and they're not trading with some of their plants in Southern Europe. I don't know why they do that. Actually, it was strange. And in fact, I asked them about Chinese export, and it's exactly what they said, what you said, Francis. That's not what they were supposed to be doing. So they weren't doing it. It's kind of important. Now, industrial structure. This is Great Britain, excluding Northern Ireland, and it's the share of output by different sectors. And there's a big spike at food and beverage. There is one at chemicals and chemical products. There is one at fabricated metal. Then there's a reasonable share in transport equipment, that would be cars, for instance. Electrical and optical. Machinery not elsewhere classified. Doesn't seem to be all that much on paper, pulp, and reproduction of recorded media. That's an important one. Also wood, and there's a mistake there, unfortunately, it seems to be through all of them. Wood and wood products, it should be. So that's GB. That's Northern Ireland. Very, very heavily concentrated in food and beverage. And then sort of a smaller concentration around some of the others. Transport equipment, that would probably be partly insurance or Bombardier, electrical and optical machinery, and so on. Now, what do you think the Republic of Ireland will look like? Will it look like anything like any of the previous two? Well, no, it doesn't. Food and beverage, high. Electrical and optical. Chemicals and chemical products. And pulp, paper, printing, and reproduction of recorded media. Now, I'll come back to those sectors in a second, but first of all, in terms of my formal analysis, well, one way to account for the structural underlying economic structure is to put the output shares in as additional variables in my analysis. That's actually quite a difficult task because you need to get the output shares by sector for 43 countries for 16 years. I think there's something like 40,000 observations if you get it all. It's hard to do. I draw my data from a number of sources. EU CLEMS is quite a good one, and if you ever need sectoral data at the national level in the EU, that's the place to go. And just Google it, you'll find it. It's a project funded by the EU at the University of Groningen. Eurostat have some additional one, and then the UN as well. What we find when we do that is that there are only two sectors where the statistically significant trade gap remains. So sectoral structure actually has an awful lot to do with the explanation of why we have a gap. So chemicals for south to north trade and transport equipment for south to north trade as well. And I'm not quite sure what's going on there. I think the chemicals chemicals and pharmaceuticals we probably explain by the explanation given by Francis that a lot of it actually goes through Belgium, and in fact if it comes back to the UK it probably has been to Belgium first. And certainly wouldn't go to Northern Ireland in the first place. Transport equipment, I have no idea what's going on there, but it's something for further study. Now, having established that sectoral structure matters, what about ownership structure? That's the multinationals versus foreign. And here we just have the output shares broken down for the Republic of Ireland by sectors, broken down for foreign and indigenous. And you see very much like chemicals, it's pretty much entirely foreign. Electrical and optical, very heavily foreign as well. Export shares, again, we will actually find chemicals and pharmaceuticals are very big. Pulp, paper, and etc. is quite high. Electrical and optical, machinery not elsewhere classified, and this strange one, transport equipment, and I'm still struggling a little bit exactly what we sell on the transport equipment side. We do make some truck trailers and various things, but we don't make cars. It must be some parts. Airplane, Republic of Ireland.
Refrigerated truck.
Yeah. But it seems very disparate, but it actually has quite a high share in our exports. Now, export shares by ownership, and I can only do this 1991 to 2004. For some strange reason, and I see Steve McFeely here, I have to be beating on the CSO here. They have changed some of their tables in the sense of industrial production, so I can't do it for any years subsequent, even though we have a 2009 CIP out. What we find typically, export shares to the UK, including, of course, Northern Ireland. Foreign firms tend to send less to the UK. And that's for all sectors for which I have data Okay. So if we have a high preponderance of foreign firms in particular sectors and they send less to the UK, you can expect that they would send less to Northern Ireland as well. So if we look at the correlation between output gap and the importance of multinational enterprises, is actually reasonably strong. It's around about 0.4, and it would seem to explain quite a bit of the remaining bit of variation in the data. Now I get to conclusions. I'm running out of time. So what I've shown is that there is a gap between what you'd expect in terms of trade, merchandise trade between the two parts of Ireland. We trade less than we would expect. In some cases that's not statistically significant, so we can argue a little bit about it. But certainly there seems to be some deviation. But that deviation seems to be crucially driven by sectoral structure and multinational enterprises. And that, I think, has an implication for policy in the sense that if that is the case, you can't change your sectoral structure overnight, and to then expect huge amounts of trade would be unreasonable. Likewise, if foreign companies have to trade with certain trading partners, it's a bit unreasonable to be asking them to do something else or expect higher trade volume somehow or another. So, to the extent that policy can actually increase the trade intensity, and we can, through that higher trade intensity, increase the gains from trade, it would seem that a focus on indigenous firms and sectors where they are much more important would seem warranted. The other thing, and I should have probably put an extra bullet point on this, I think this analysis has some important implications to our thinking around input-output multipliers at the regional level within the Republic of Ireland. Sometimes policy measures are justified on the basis of very high input-output multipliers. It would seem that certainly some of these things leak away quite substantially, and they leak away outside of Ireland because of the particular trading patterns that we have. And so the benefits are probably much more modest than we would expect them to be. Of course, that's another paper, and Steve's woken up. That's where you have been doing some work. But anyway, I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.